Hello there, people of the internet. Was the M14 made obsolete as soon as it was created and ran out of the factory and adopted by the U.S. military forces? I hear a lot of comments about people telling me that the M14 was obsolete literally as soon as it was developed and designed and adopted. I think I hear people telling me that the M14 is the absolute best platform, even by today's standards, that can absolutely not be outdone by literally anything, including the modern equipment that we have nowadays. So ultimately, the decision is up to you as to what your opinion is, and by all means, you have your opinion, you use whatever it is that you want to use. I'm not going to judge you for that. I don't have an M14, but I do have this Ruger Mini 14, which we're going to use as an example, a representation of the M14 series. So whenever we call something obsolete, I don't think a lot of people really understand what the word obsolete actually means. Obsolete means that it is no longer in use by anyone, and by that actual definition of what obsolete means, no, the M14 was absolutely not obsolete whenever it was created, because it was used for a decade and some additional years after its creation by the United States military forces. So no, it was not obsolete. Nowadays, it might be obsolescent, but it is still very much in use. I think the term people are looking for whenever they call the M14 obsolete is they are confusing the term obsolete with the term antiquated. Whenever you're dealing with an antiquated design, a lot of times you're dealing with a design that was designed many, many years ago. Like, for example, I have also out here a Turkish Mauser, chambered in 8mm Mauser. This way is a 1898 action, and this one is a 1942 production, so the Second World War. By the time the Second World War had come out and this rifle was still very much being used, it was antiquated technology, not obsolete because it was very much being used, but definitely antiquated because in comparison to some other technologies out there, such as the M1 Garand at the time or the SVT-40 or something like that, this bolt-action 5-shot internal magazine firearm was definitely an antiquated design. It was a design from a previous generation that was still being used in a generation that had much, much better technology. So whenever we think about the M14 and when it was made, what other technology had come around during that time period? So let's look about what happened with that time period. It was right after World War II, and countries were looking to standardize ammunition, and they wanted some sort of intermediate cartridge. They saw the effectiveness of the intermediate cartridge that Germany was utilizing, the 8mm Kurz, and they saw that the effectiveness of that intermediate cartridge was effective enough to be able to reach out to the distances combat was taking place at, and effective enough to be able to take out infantry and do basically everything that a standard infantry rifle is supposed to do, while at the same time it was powerful enough to basically handle all of the things that needed to be handled at distances that, needed to be handled, and it was adequate enough. An intermediate cartridge was adequate enough, but it was lightweight and smaller to where soldiers could carry more ammunition. And the firearms were developed to where they could be both select fire, meaning they could be fully automatic or semi-automatic, depending on what the situation called for. And they held more ammunition inside of the magazine before you had to reload. And Germany was using external magazines with the development of their Sturmgewehr, and there was definitely one of the bigger innovative design, the bigger innovative design aspects that a lot of people were paying attention to. They were paying attention to the Sturmgewehr and the pros and cons behind that particular system, including the intermediate ammunition and the use of larger capacity magazines that were external. So the United States wanted to utilize this intermediate cartridge while at the same time retaining the same power of their old M2 30-06. So the 7.62 NATO cartridge was eventually born, and this is, what people still use nowadays. It's a 150-ish grain bullet traveling at about 2,800-ish feet per second. And that there mimics the M2 ball round, which was the same projectile traveling at about the same speed. But due to modern propellants, the 7.62 NATO case is significantly shorter. And so it's kind of a debate as to whether or not that is a true intermediate cartridge, because it has the power of the M2 ball 30-06. But at the same time, it is a shorter, smaller size case. So ultimately the decision as to whether or not that is actually intermediate is up to you guys. I will let you all go down and argue about that in the comments. However, anyone who has ever used 7.62 NATO and rapid fired it knows that 7.62 NATO in a full auto shoulder fired rifle is pretty much completely unusable. The only way to actually practically use that is to have a semi-automatic platform so you can actually, make your shots on target. So the idea of 7.62 NATO as an intermediate cartridge to be used in full auto was just completely thrown out the window, to the point to where even the U.S. military was like, all right, full auto on our M14s, we don't need it. We're just going to go ahead and use semi-automatic systems only. So the M14 was a full power rifle cartridge that had intermediate ideals behind it. Man, Kevin is just screaming up a storm today. Kevin's my peacock. I got 4 of them. They're all named Kevin. So the cartridge itself was already what I would consider to be antiquated, considering that that there were countries out there that were adopting much flatter shooting, much more capable, much more compact, much more lighter weight ammunition. Like I think the British were developing a 270 cartridge of some kind. I don't necessarily know a whole lot about that, but the United States pretty much strong-armed everybody into adopting the 7.62 NATO. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that a lot of these countries were wanting to adopt one universal do-everything cartridge, so if another worldwide conflict broke out, they all, just logistically speaking, only had to worry about one particular kind of ammunition. And of course 7.62 NATO was still deemed to be too powerful, so eventually 5.56 NATO ended up becoming a thing, and a lot of people see that as too weak, and there's a whole argument and debate on that right there, but that's a little out of the scope of this video. The M14 was already made with a too powerful of cartridge, and it was made basing older technology off of more modern ideals. Like, for example, with the M14, this right here, like I said, is a Mini 14. You'll have to get over it. With the M14, you had your external mag, although this was a rock and lock magazine, and that was definitely not ideal for a generation where push-in magazines were becoming much more predominant and much more available. But this right here was a rock and lock magazine. You have this exposed bolt on the top of the system. Clearly the M14 had gotten a lot of inspiration from the M1 Grand systems that had preceded it, but you have a bolt that is on the top of the system. You can get all sorts of dirt and funk and whatnot into the system from this bolt right here. The locking lugs are literally right here exposed on the top of the bolt, whereas a lot of other systems, a lot of your other firearms that were in development during this time period used lighter weight ammunition, used magazines that could be inserted versus just rocked and locked, and had bolts that were covered by whatever system was being used. Like, for example, the AK-47, that technically, yes, did come out about that same time period. There were some development issues for the AK, but the AK and the SKS, they had bolts that were internal to the rifle, and so as a result, the bolt itself did not, like, it was difficult to actually get the bolt dirty. And on the back of the receiver, you have this big old hole on the back of the receiver, and I have had literally this rifle right here malfunction from debris and whatnot getting into that hole. The fire control group is right there, and the firing pin is right there because it's on the back of the bolt, and there's all sorts of crap right here that could go horribly wrong if you end up getting some crap in there. So as a result, well, there's just definitely a weak point of the rifle, and that is the result of just the design of the receiver, and that is a direct descendant from the M1 Grand system, which was designed in the 1930s, some 20-something years before the M14 had actually come out. So you have this old school receiver design that had this big gaping hole in it, exposed bolts, you had a tilting rock and lock system, and you had a full power cartridge that was just claiming to be intermediate. And so as a result, you really could not use it for full auto capabilities. It simply was too powerful to be controllable. So there were some issues with the M14. On top of that, with it being a top eject system, you can't really viably mount any sort of optics onto that thing, whereas there were other systems coming out that you could very much easily mount optics on top of because they were side ejection, or where the ejection was, there was enough room for eye relief and whatnot. This time period wasn't really ideal for optics and whatnot, but they certainly did exist. So there was certainly a lot of downsides with the M14 whenever it had come out, and there are people out there to this day who will tell me the M14 is the absolute best XYZ, insert whatever cause or reasoning or rationale that they have here. And then there are people who will tell me that the M14 was obsolete as soon as it came out. Obviously not obsolete, because it was literally being used as soon as it came out. So definitely not obsolete by any stretch of the imagination, but I would call it antiquated. It was people trying to use older technology to make a more modern rifle, and a lot of that has to do with traditionalism, and that's something that still runs rampant nowadays. That's why people will people of that traditionalist mindset will go to something like this, like a Ruger Mini 14, as opposed to something like this, an AR platform, simply because this is scary and different than what they know. It's not wood and steel, despite the fact that these both send 223 5.56 ammunition downrange as fast as you can pull the trigger. They both do literally the exact same things. Traditionalism and wanting to use a design that your soldiers already know and are already familiar with. All things considered, the M14 was basically an M1 Grand in a different cartridge that had, well, a magazine on the bottom. There were some updates to the gas system as well. The M14 actually pulled a lot of inspiration from the gas system of the M1 carbine. They are definitely not identical, but there's some clear situations, some clear examples with the M14's gas system that is reminiscent of the M1 carbine's gas system. So ultimately, the decision of whether or not the M14 came out as an antiquated rifle is entirely up to you, and what your desires and bases and what it is that you want, like, it's completely up to you. The idea of the M14 being obsolete and people being for it or against it, I feel like that this has stemmed multiple times within history. I imagine that whenever the 1911 came out, there were plenty of people who were like, hey, the 1873 and 45 long Colt, that is absolutely adequate enough. You don't need that 1911. That 1911 is just absolute trash. And I imagine that there were people of that mindset. Or whenever the 1873 came out, there were probably people who were like, hey, I'd rather take the percussion cap revolver. It's got 6 shots as opposed to your 5 shots, because you had to keep an empty cylinder so you don't detonate a cartridge into the side of your leg. I'd rather take the percussion cap, because now I don't have to worry about brass and trimming, and, you know, loading this thing is a lot easier than reloading the ammunition for that 1873. And I mean, if I run out of ammunition in a gunfight, there's no way I'm going to have time to reload either, so I'd rather just have the 6 shots. And this mindset, this traditionalist mindset of avoiding newer technology in favor of older technology, just because you prefer that older technology based off of your biases and opinions, well, there's just how a lot of people go. And whenever it came to the development of the M14, with all of the other development that was going on around the world, the Sturmgewehr had already existed, the AK-47 was already in existence. A lot of other countries were looking at other firearms that were dramatically more of a modern design than your M14. Like I said a couple of times now, you're going to have to decide for yourself whether or not it was antiquated. I say yes, but a lot of other people still think that the M14 is the absolute best thing beyond all reasonable doubt, even to this day, even in 7.62 NATO, even though there are better, harder hitting, flatter shooting cartridges out there that are lighter weight and smaller projectile, and just all around better for all around situations. Now, like I said, I don't have an M14 or even an M1A. I do, however, have this Mini 14, so we're going to go ahead and send some lead down range here. 223 5.56 is a lot cheaper than 7.62 NATO as well. This is a really nice gun. With it already being light recoil, we got this big butt pad on the back. I ought to shoot this thing more. As a matter of fact, I think I will shoot this thing more. I'm going to set it right here, put some more rounds through this. Thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share, description below, link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. I imagine this video probably ruffled some feathers, and oh boy, is it probably going to make some people angry. Let me know what you guys think down below, and I will see you guys on the next video. I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.